I think that there's no doubt that the Bible is filled with human error, both the copies that we have, which are changed by scribes. There's nobody who can doubt this. All you need to do is take two manuscripts and compare them with one another, and they'll differ in hundreds, maybe thousands of places.
So if people say to you, the Bible is the Word of God, what do you say?
I usually respond by asking, which Bible? Is it the Bible that you buy in a local bookstore? Is the Bible found in manuscripts? If in manuscripts, which manuscripts?
Let's look at some examples of those differences and discrepancies. Perhaps the most remarkable is that these early manuscripts do not mention the ascension of Jesus into heaven, or, arguably, the resurrection. Bart Ehrman again.
Jesus does rise from the dead in Mark's Gospel. The women go to the tomb is empty, and there's a man there who tells them that Jesus has been raised from the dead and that they're to go tell the disciples that this has happened. But then the Gospel ends in Codex Sinaiticus and other manuscripts by saying the women fled from the tomb and didn't say anything to anyone because they were afraid, period. That's where the gospel ends. So nobody finds out about it. The disciples don't learn about it. The disciples never see Jesus after the resurrection. That's the end of the story. But later scribes couldn't handle this abrupt ending, and they added the 12 verses that people will find in the King James Bible or other Bibles in which Jesus does appear to his disciples.
You find that the version is different, and what happened was that people at some point said, this is a very strange ending.
Professor David Parker.
They go to the tomb, they're told that Jesus is risen, they go away and they don't say anything to anybody because they were afraid. And that's it. And people say, well, that's not the way to end a gospel. And what they produce is a little pastiche of the different resurrection narratives you have in other gospels, little summaries of them, putting in what you would expect to be provided, so that it becomes a proper gospel.
So in the case of Mark, which is the first gospel, you're absolutely confident that as originally written, the resurrection story is missing.
That's right. And if you look at the beginning of the gospel also, you can see interesting things. You can see that it became the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ, the Son of God. But the oldest copies again say the beginning of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Yes, little changes like that, but changing the ending of a story is crucial, isn't it? That changes everything that goes before.
These are, of course, major changes, dealing with the central issues of faith about who Jesus was. But there are other differences concerned with how Jesus behaved. For example, was Jesus moved with compassion when he met a blind man, or angry?
In the Codex, Jesus is angry, and in later versions of the text, the one that perhaps people in English know better, was moved with compassion.
There's a vast difference between that. I mean, he either was irritated or he showed compassion. Why would it change?
Well, perhaps Jesus was angry in the older version of the text, because that's a very natural human reaction. Perhaps he's angry with the situation, frustrated, but perhaps later that became something which people didn't think was quite so appropriate for Jesus. Though it's fair to say that Jesus is angry in other places in the Gospels, and it's not changed. But perhaps people did have some difficulty with anger, because there's also a fascinating place in the Codex, in the Sermon on the Mount, where we can see a change to the text, altering the attitude to anger. Jesus says, the person who is angry with his brother deserves judgment. But there's a variation on that. If you look at the page in Codex Sinaiticus, you'll see that somebody's added a little word in the margin in Greek, which changes it to the person who is angry with his brother without good reason deserves judgment. And there you've got two very different views of the Christian life.
As I said earlier, the Codex Sinaiticus includes two books later dropped from the canon, possibly by the Emperor Constantine himself, the Shepherd of Hermas and the Epistle of Barnabas. The former is harmless, full of visions and revelations. The latter is anything but harmless, full of anti-Semitic kindling just waiting to be lit. The book of Barnabas goes out of its way to claim that it was the Jews, not the Romans, who killed Jesus. Bart Ehrman.
The author of Barnabas thinks that the covenant that God made with the Jews was broken immediately upon having been made, when Moses smashed the tablets of the Ten Commandments, so that the Jews never were the people of God, that Christians are the people of God, and that Jews have always been a hard-headed, stiff-necked people whom God has rejected. As Christianity gets stronger and stronger in the empire in the 2nd, 3rd, and 4th centuries, it becomes more and more anti-Jewish. Christians apparently felt they had to oppose Jews in order to justify their own existence as a separate religion from Judaism. And so you find in the manuscripts of the New Testament scribes who changed the text in places in order to incorporate their own anti-Jewish views.
If the Epistle of Barnabas had survived, presumably it would have given even more ammunition to 20th century anti-Semites.
The kinds of anti-Semitism you see through the Middle Ages down through the 20th century, culminating in the Holocaust, if possible, would have been even worse.
There are many other differences between our oldest Bible, the Codex, and the versions we use today. Missing is the story of the woman taken in adultery, for example, and there are no words of forgiveness from Christ on the cross. Most Christians, all but the fundamentalists, have long accepted that, while the Bible is authoritative, it is not infallible. Human hands make mistakes, and humans have minds of their own. Ulrich Schneider from Leipzig is sure this would not have bothered Tischendorf, and for David Parker, it's positively liberating.
I don't think that a historically minded theologian like Tischendorf was ever worried about different versions of the Bible. I think he found it thrilling to see that the Word of God was, so to speak, in an editing process over several centuries and was really moving the hearts and the minds of the people, of the scribes. That's even today a most wonderful thing to see in the Codex Sinaiticus, just because it's not so very perfect.
The text is changing. Every time that I make an edition of the Greek New Testament, or anybody does, we change the wording. We are maybe trying to get back to the oldest possible form, but paradoxically, we are creating a new one. Every translation is different. Every reading is different. And although there's been a tradition in parts of Protestant Christianity to say there is a definitive single form of the text, the fact is you can never find it. Orthodoxy accepts, in the living Christian tradition, the text as it developed, the text as it was by the 10th century or the 12th century.
Do you find this process for you a disillusioning one or a liberating one?
I find it liberating. In the first place, historically, it's the only way I can make sense of the data. In the second place, I don't believe that Christianity is a religion of the book in the sense that there is a fixed form of text, that revelation is simply through a book. To me, this concept of the text as if you like to use my own phrase, a living text, is much more coherent with what Christianity should be about, which is discovering the truth, not simply being given it in some fixed, unchanging form.
I'm sitting on the walls of St. Catherine's in the short twilight at the end of my visit to the monastery. 100 years ago, you could only reach here after 2 weeks crossing the desert by camel, and only a handful of scholars was able to see what is left of the Codex Sinaiticus. By next summer, everyone with access to a computer will be able to see the Codex whole in digital form, its different parts at last reunited. But the monks of St. Catherine's still hope and pray that the real Codex one day will come back here to Sinai, its home for around 1,500 years.
The Oldest Bible was presented by Roger Bolton and produced by David Coombs. It was a CTVC production for BBC Radio 4.